Obviously, investment is a very important area of cooperation between EU and GCC, and EU and GCC are actually very big global players in the area of foreign direct investment, covering more than half of global FDI. But of course, they are also very important investors mutually. So if I looked at the statistic of FDI stocks a couple of years back, I see that we are mutually invested for more than 360 billion euros. So it's a very impressive figure, but there's still a lot of potential. And that's what we are going to be discussing today. So both EU and GCC have been engaged in reform efforts to further facilitate FDI, which is so important for the growth of our economies and employment. There are new business models and products that are connected to green and digital transitions that we have discussed already earlier today. These new transitions have opened up, of course, new investment opportunities, but also challenges in terms of new standards being developed and also through enhanced public scrutiny. So there is definitely a need for further dialogue between EU and GCC to foster further this investment relationship and indeed a strategic partnership that has been established between GCC and the EU. And this is needed both at the governmental and at business level. Now, at the governmental level, we do have a very useful annual trade and investment dialogue that discusses at a high level of how we can further improve this partnership. And we are in the process of expanding this dialogue, in particular to cover these new areas of green and digital transition. At the same time, we see further potential to enhance connections at the business level. And we are, for example, looking at the creation of EU-GCC chambers of commerce in some of the GCC countries. As for the time being, they do not exist. Now, before going to the really substance of this panel, I would like to give just 3 minutes to each of the panelists to very briefly present themselves. And we start perhaps with Ms. Saima.
Thank you, Timo. Just by way of background, my name is Shema Laidarous. I'm the Director of the Trade Negotiations Department at the Ministry of Economy in the UAE. My previous background was in climate negotiations. So I've been working with the EU Secretariat ever since I was part of the climate negotiations. And there were always areas of alignment and coordination between the EU and the GCC, and I'm happy to be here today.
Okay, Basil.
Hi, my name is Basil Awami. I'm head of the Foreign Affairs Department at the Federation of GCC Chambers of Commerce and Industry. What the Federation of GCC Chambers of Commerce and Industry is, it's the umbrella of the 6 federations and chambers of commerce and industry in the 6 GCC states. Firstly, Federation of UAE Chambers of Commerce. You got the Bahrain Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Federation of Saudi Chambers of Commerce. You got the Oman Chamber of Commerce, Qatar Chamber of Commerce, and Kuwait Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We are a non-profit organization that support our member chambers plus the private sector in the region. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I am Sofia Bournou, Senior Advisor in the International Relations Department of Business Europe. Business Europe is the umbrella organization of all the industrial and employer organizations in Europe. Our members come from 35 countries, so we go beyond the EU. We cover the whole European economic space and also accession countries to the EU. And coming from the International Trade Department, our main focus is EU trade policy, EU investment policy, and of course we maintain very good contacts and cooperation with our global counterparts, including in the GCC. So of course, very happy to be here today with you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pascal Kerneis. I'm the Managing Director of the European Services Forum, which is one of the thousands of organizations here in Brussels representing business. Our specificity is that we are representing all the services industries which have an interest to export and to invest outside the European Union. So I'm looking to the world and not to the single market. And maybe a few words to explain what services is, because it is so big that it's difficult to encompass, but it is gathering everything which is not mining, agriculture, or manufacturing. Namely, in Europe, 75% of the economy. I'm talking here about banks and insurance and all the professional services like the lawyers, the engineers, the accountant, the telecom industry and the IT and digital sectors industry, the distribution and retail and wholesale, the environmental services, the construction services, and a very important part which is the transport and logistics services, which is also very much linked to trading goods.
Thank you very much, dear panelists. So then we start the discussion. I would like to ask first a question to you regarding changes to business environment. So which changes to business environment are, in your view, the most pressing to facilitate investments at the EU-GCC level? And what is needed from both the public and private sectors to catalyze these changes? And perhaps we start with you, Pascal.
Sure, with pleasure. Well, I mean, this session is effectively focusing on investment going from the European Union to the GCC and how can we improve this. But I'd like first to acknowledge that there is a huge and massive, as you said already, Timo, massive investment from the GCC to the European Union. And that is, I think, important to remind. And that investment from the GCC to the EU, it's around 300 billion. It's 3 times bigger than our investment to the European Union, to the GCC region. Can we take any conclusion out of this? No, not yet, certainly. But the question is, can we improve this environment in the GCC for our bigger investment going to the region? Knowing that the European Union is by very far the biggest investors into the world, so we invest everywhere. And an additional part from my side is that more than 65% of all foreign direct investment is actually coming from services sectors. Even if we never do the headlines, and it is more about the car industry and chemical plants which make the headlines, the bulk of the investment coming from the European Union to the rest of the world is indeed coming from services sectors. Now, how can we improve this? To improve it, I think first we need to identify barriers. What are the potential barriers that our companies will be encountering if we want to do more business in the region? There are still some countries in GCC where you do have some equity caps. It has evolved in the last years, but nevertheless, some of the GCC countries do have equity caps, and therefore you cannot own completely the company that you want to create. You have to go through a joint venture. And in some of those countries, in some sectors, you cannot own the majority of it, so you cannot control. And that is a proper barrier. For services companies, it is not like the good sectors where you can eventually slice down the production and therefore not losing the control of it. But for services, if you do not have the control, you are not owning the soul and the know-how of the company, and therefore you just, most of the time, do not invest. So that is one of the major barriers. When we look at other possibilities and difficulties doing business in the region, there is often mentioned by business the length of the legal proceeding and the legal process into the country, going to the legal court or getting some legal issues to get the authorization process, and that is something which is seen as a problem. You still do have investment promotion board or investment board or screening board, which is also giving uncertainty about if you want to invest in the region, you're not completely sure that your project is going to be approved. A barrier which is often mentioned as well, trying to do business on site, is to hire staff, to find the skills, the proper skills if you want to get there, to have the visa if you want to bring some intra-corporate transferees in the region. So the restriction on hiring is another problem. And then access to public procurement is another issue which is often mentioned. It's complicated to get access to the public procurement for foreign companies in the region. And none of the countries are member of the government procurement agreement of the WTO, and therefore that would be something, an area where progress would be welcome. So to now bring some solutions to that, well, as I said at the beginning, if we could have 100% of the ownership of the subsidiaries that we want to create in the region, that would certainly be helpful. A more transparent legal system, I think, is required, notably for the protection of the intellectual property rights. And on the legal disputes, because there is no visibility at all, and if you don't have a sound dispute settlement in a country, when you eventually meet a problem, you are more, so happy to go in there. And I will insist very much on the facilitation of the licensing procedures and the authorization processes for foreign companies to set up an office, a subsidiary, a plant over there, which require more transparency on the domestic regulation. And there is, I'm making the link here with a recent agreement that the WTO has, 67 countries in the WTO have agreed upon on services domestic regulation, where the countries have decided to go for making more transparent their regulation and giving more transparency on the licensing procedures. So very practical details. Where do I have to knock the door to get my license? Do I need a license? How much does it cost? How long does it take? Can I make an appeal? All of these practical questions that a business person will ask, if you can put that clearly there. So this agreement on domestic regulation, I think, is very good. There are many GCC countries which are now a member. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE joined in last June. So there are still 3 countries which are not part of it, and I think we certainly would like to invite them. And then we talked about all the different panelists, I think, today talked about the education and getting better access and increasing the upskilling and reskilling the country will certainly be helpful as well. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal. That's a very comprehensive list of certain challenges that EU investors may still face when investing in the Gulf, and of course that may explain that discrepancy between the investments between the Gulf and the EU. Now, Sofia, coming from a Business Europe background, what is the feedback you get from your member companies and organizations in terms of how could we fill in this gap that exists now currently between the investment of the 2 regions?
Thank you. I think Pascal covered a lot of the very specific issues of concerns that we face when we ask our members what type of challenges do you face when it comes to taking an investment decision that concerns the GCC. And I will not repeat them, of course, but I think that there is a general tone when we discuss with our members, and this is, what do business need? They need stability and predictability. So everything is linked to the way the market operates and the legal system operates on the one hand. And this is very critical. As Pascal said, when you have a problem and you don't have recourse to justice, and also to arrive to a result, to a decision, it takes time, then this is a very big problem. Procurement is another one, and especially now that we face big projects in the context of the green and digital transition, these are 2 key areas where procurement needs to be enhanced and access to those contracts for foreign companies. Now, I would like to focus a little bit perhaps on another aspect that is coming more and more prominent in our discussion. So beyond the stability and the predictability, which are, if you like, the classical factors that we come up against in these discussions, is the sustainability perspective. And also the previous panel referred to that, because we have a very robust, let's say, legislative framework already in place or coming up in the EU that is going to affect this exact dimension of business decisions. And I'm referring, of course, to the Green Deal and the CBAM in particular, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, but I am also referring to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. That was the example that the previous panel gave. But I would also like to mention the forced labor ban proposal that came up by the Commission, and of course the new framework in which the EU negotiates trade agreements. And there is a sustainability element there. And we are talking about 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, labor, and environmental one. So I think this type of legislation is going to affect very much how European, at least, investors operate and the decisions they take, where to go to invest. Would I have a partner that understands the kind of demands that I am going to face from the EU legislators? So I think that this is an open discussion that we need to have, and maybe this is also a plea to the Commission from our part to have this open discussion, especially with our GCC counterparts. Because if I link this debate with the diversification one that we had also earlier this afternoon, and the need to find better ways to improve our dialogue and deliver on the trade and investment dialogue that we have, I think this is a key aspect that we need to bring here.
Thank you very much, Sofia.
And maybe just one solution I can offer here, Timo, sorry for that. Pascal referred to the WTO and the domestic services regulation. I would like to refer to the joint statement initiative on the investment facilitation. I think this is a key element that we can work with, because many GCC countries, together with the EU, participate in this process. And it's not about creating new rules, it's about improving transparency, it's about improving the notification systems, it's about engagement. So I think that this is also a very important effort. Combined with the soft and the hard policy elements, if you like, this is something that perhaps could offer solutions to overcome these kind of challenges at regulatory level.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I believe that the more aligned our policies are, the easier and more comfortable for our investors it will be to invest to each other's regions. So that's a very good point you are making there. Well, Shaima, from the point of view of Emirates, we, of course, know that the Emirates are quite well invested in the EU, but would you see, on one hand, elements that would further facilitate your investment in the EU, or on the other hand, do you see possibilities to further facilitate EU investment in your country, in addition to efforts already taken?
Thank you so much for the question. Maybe in my response, I will react to a few things outlined by my fellow speakers. So as you mentioned, we invest heavily in the EU. I think the UAE is the second leading market for EU's outward investment, and we are ranked third among countries globally in terms of FDI into the EU. From the UAE's perspective, the public and private sector both have a critical role in facilitating greater investment between the EU and the UAE. So in the UAE, in response to what Pascal has mentioned, we have been working very hard in the last decade, but specifically in the last 2-3 years, to perform all the legislative reforms that would facilitate businesses' investment towards the UAE, but also use UAE as a hub for trade and investment globally. So some of the reforms that we have undertaken includes, it's a long list, so bear with me. So to enable investors, entrepreneurs, and businesses to establish and thrive in the UAE, recent measures includes liberalizing foreign ownership. So it's 100% foreign equity partnership, strengthening corporate governance and reducing trade barriers. And we also brought about substantive legislative reforms to enhance our investment environment, including the 100% ownership of businesses, recognition of arbitral awards, recognition of UK court decisions using principles of reciprocity, restating corporate codes, and introducing new regulations for novel technology sectors such as Web3 and crypto. So these kind of reforms also is complemented by the residency reform that we have introduced. So it also increases our human capital by investing in education, improving the quality of education, attracting specialized talent to the UAE from all over the world to live and work in the UAE. So these initiatives have been working very well for the UAE, and we've seen other GCC countries also implementing similar measures. I think COVID was a great kind of push for governments to think creatively, to introduce and induce resilience and cut all the red tapes that are considered trade barriers and all of that.
Thank you very much, Saima. Indeed, you mentioned the reform programs that UAE has taken, but also the other GCC countries have engaged in quite serious reform programs. They're usually called visions. And indeed, these are very crucial to private sector growth and have already had a very good and positive impact on the business environment. So, Basil, from the perspective of the GCC, since your chamber covers all of them, how would you describe the situation?
Yes, well, the GCC countries have taken proactive steps to diversify its economies through adopting certain visions. 2030 visions, 2040 visions in some of the GCC countries. Of course, the vision aims to diversify the economy through empowering many sectors, plus opening new economic sectors, generating more jobs, and drive the economic development. By 2030 alone, Saudi Arabia will have at least 5 universities among the top 200 universities in the world. And of course, refocusing on small and medium enterprises by encouraging financial assistance, increasing the contribution of SMEs to GDP from 20 to 35%. Let alone many projects just the past couple of years have emerged in renewable energy, education, privatization, public-private partnerships, agri-technology, healthcare, and so on. As you might know, SMEs is considered the engine of growth in many countries, whereas in Europe it consists of 99% of the economy. Just in 2005, the EU reported 23 million SMEs have generated over 75 million jobs and contribute strongly to the EU's GDP. All GCC members share the view on importance of energizing the private sector. Improving the business environment is an integral part of promoting SMEs and the private sector at large. Therefore, to learn from the European counterparts on ways to bolster performance of SMEs in the GCC region, both private and public sector need to develop common policies and plans to deal with these issues, to alleviate taxes and protection procedures against the GCC exports to European market, to increase the European investments in technologies and digital sectors in the GCC. And of course, to have partnerships to implement many of the emerging projects in the Gulf countries.
Thank you very much, Basil. Moving on and perhaps a little bit more into detail on those problems that Pascal described for the EU companies to invest in the GCC. Despite the efforts, there are still some challenges as he described. So perhaps I'd like to ask our GCC colleagues what further could be done to facilitate the foreign direct investment in the GCC, and what kind of steps are already envisioned to facilitate that? And Shaima, would you like to comment further on that?
So I think creating awareness is key within the EU. I think it's a good starting point. Within the UAE, we have a number of economic reforms, as I mentioned, and FDI initiatives that we continue to promote through continued collaboration amongst chambers of commerce, cross-embassy dialogue, and counterpart ministries as well. And it has led to a greater awareness of our program and increased interest and understanding by foreign companies and communities. Educating them, raising awareness on our market entry processes, competitor landscape, market caps, and sector opportunities, equipping them with information and data required to make executive decisions to invest. I think having discussions like these are very helpful. It's a good starting point, but getting into the details of sector-specific, what are the red tapes, what are the opportunities, matchmaking the interests with the right kind of partners. I think that could drive partnership and, or at least enhance partnership between the EU and the GCC.
Thank you very much. Well, matchmaking is something that we are also trying to do with this investment forum. So seems that we are on the right track. And Basil, perhaps you'd like to add something?
Well, all GCC countries allow 100% foreign ownership in almost sectors, including trade, e-commerce, industry, and many others. We need to have dialogue. We need more investment in different sectors in the GCC. Now, 70% of the EU companies that invest in the GCC, they invest in the oil and gas. We need more investments in different sectors, especially the new emerging sectors in health technology, in agri-food, in renewable energy, in education, and so on and so forth. So we need more investment in different sectors of the economy rather than just only the oil and gas.
Thank you very much, Basil. You're absolutely right there. Now, if you look at somebody mentioned, you mentioned awareness, that it's important that there's increased awareness about the investment opportunities and also about the problems that can exist there at the EU-GCC interface. So how can this awareness be strengthened further? And how can particularly the profile of the SMEs be elevated? I mean, Basil mentioned the SMEs already. I think it's fair to say that in the EU we are more advanced in our SME policy, but it's also something that has been clearly identified in the Gulf, that that's a sector that has to grow. So any advice our EU colleagues could give, starting from Sofia?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that there are several things that we can do to improve the situation here. And first of all is using projects like this one, the EU-GCC Dialogue on Economic Diversification, to increase awareness and open up this dialogue to more companies and SMEs in particular. The second thing we can look at is, of course, easing the regulation in general. And I will talk about digital solutions. So e-government, e-procurement, e-customs, everything that reduces the cost and the time that the company, especially SMEs, consume or have to dedicate to deliver a transaction or a good. This is something that has come up very vividly during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis and all the disruptions in supply chain. So everything we can do to simplify processes and reduce burden and cost for SMEs is critical. And then another point is access to finance. For many SMEs, including European ones, access to finance remains a key concern. We have the tools, but sometimes we don't know that the tools are there. So what do we do to increase awareness of the existing instruments? We don't know about GCC tools. I'm pretty sure that all the 6 countries do have this kind of initiatives, but we are not aware of them. And then maybe a last point related to that and how governments perhaps communicate on these opportunities and possibilities is to create a one-stop shop specifically for opportunities of investments in the countries, where you explain the opportunities sector by sector, where you describe the legislation that needs to be applied and all the requirements that companies would have to fulfill in order to be able to participate in these opportunities. So just a few ideas, maybe to hear also more about what the GCC region is doing to support SMEs and awareness. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much, Sofia. And I think in that respect, of course, the Enterprise Europe Network that was discussed earlier today could be a very important tool to spread that information also, what is the policy for SMEs. Pascal, would you like to add?
Yes. I mean, Sofia already covered a lot. So more interaction tools we have to go for businesses and how to do that. The EEN, the European Enterprise Network, has been mentioned 2 or 3 times, including by Trade Commissioner. and the possibility to have more GCC companies being part of that network I think is certainly a very good initiative, and someone has to push for that. There is also a network of promotion agencies, investment promotion agencies, from within the region. Then you have, and I met someone here, some European countries have also themselves some promotion agencies or whatever bureaus in the region. Maybe they're not sufficiently known, and it would be good eventually that all of those networks will work together. Maybe under the aegis of the European delegation, they're making them matchmaking between themselves first, so that they then can create events and fair and whatever forum you want to have matchmaking exercises between companies. You mentioned, Timo, the necessity to create a European Chamber of Commerce, either one for the GCC or one in each of the GCC countries or in some of the GCC countries. But I think it would be something that, I mean, most of business are already gathered either through National Chamber of Commerce in other countries or European Chamber of Commerce in the country. If that is not yet in existence in the GCC, I think that's probably going to be a good move. Then I mentioned this necessity to have the transparency of the regulation so that the business would know where to find the information. Because even before going to an agency, you already need to have the idea. And before going and say, okay, I'm going to meet this guy because I don't know anything about it. No, of course it doesn't work that way. So you would need to find some previous information before to say, oh, is this really a country I would like to invest? And to do that, the European Union has started to create some guides. And the guides for explaining the benefit of FTAs on trading goods and an SPS on chemicals, etc., exist on rules of origin. But beyond that, you have a whole array of legislations which are really opaque and difficult to find out. To create what Sophia mentioned as a one-stop shop, to find one website where you can find all of this information, creating a guide where a company would know, if I am from that sector, where do I have to knock the door for? So all of these practical things, by developing these guides for investors or exporters, I think it's something probably very worthwhile to invest in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Indeed, you mentioned the investment promotion agencies, which is, of course, an important tool for both GCC countries and the EU. But in there, the EU doesn't have the economical scale because all these investment promotion agencies work only for their country. They are in quite a severe competition with each other, and I believe that's also the case for the Gulf countries. But indeed, important role in this respect as well. But I saw that Basil wanted to come in.
Well, yes. By the way, the German Chamber of Commerce, they have offices in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE. It's called AHAC. Yes? And also, you should utilize the Arab Joint Chambers of Commerce. There is a Belgium Arab Chamber of Commerce here. Throughout Europe, the Arab Franco Chamber of Commerce. You got the Arab German Chamber of Commerce. You have so many Arab Chambers of Commerce that you can approach to acquire all the investment opportunities in the Gulf region, plus in the Arab world as well, too.
Thank you, Basil. That was very, very good point that you made, that you are actually better organized in this way than we in the EU, because you have a GCC level Chambers of Commerce, and plus you have the Arab Chambers of Commerce, but we still have only our national Chambers of Commerce, so that's something where we can clearly learn from you. Very good. Then moving forward, if you look at the new opportunities and challenges of the transition to new economies, you can also call them transition into Industry 4.0 or 5.0, that was also mentioned earlier today. We, of course, face the dilemma of the need to implement new regulatory and legal frameworks. And this can be also a difficulty in some ways. So how can we reconcile this need for the new regulatory and legal frameworks with the need for attractive business environment? What sort of opportunities and challenges are there? So Pascal, perhaps you could start.
Well, I'm very much these days into, like everybody, I guess, into digital. And in Europe, we have the champion of the regulatory environment in the person of Commissioner Breton. So we have now built a very strong, maybe sometimes too strict environment on digital. And I think if we want to increase trade between EU and the GCC and moving on into Industry 4.0 to Industry 5.0, I think a lot is about digital. And there, I agree with Julia earlier on saying that if we want to really take profit of the innovation and the digitalization and the transformation of the economy through the digital, we need to have data to flow. And nowadays, and to be honest, I don't know exactly what the status of the legislation in the GCC is, but nowadays there are more and more countries which are raising barriers in the digital world and making things more complicated, often with a very good feeling and willingness. But I was very interested in the debate earlier on about localization. If you do impose localization on data, there we have a problem. Because localization of production, I can understand, localization of data will put a stop into the digitalization of the world economy. So that is very dangerous. But unfortunately, this is what we are now witnessing all over the world. All countries take decision to restrict flow of data, asking for localization requirement, believing that if they ask the data to be localized into their own country, possibly new jobs and growth is going to be created. That is possibly for industrial production, but for data, this is not going to happen. And what is going to happen is that we will have the data not coming to the country, or they will have specific environment for that specific country with old software that will not take benefit of the innovation. The digitalization is really about taking profit of making one or two different places where the data is stored and then can be circulated everywhere without any borders. But if you look at the OECD, they have developed a digital STRI for Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, and there you have a long, long list of new barriers that countries are erecting either into the legislative field or into the technical field. So under the cover of cybersecurity or whatever good reason, they impose to have the data localized, or they ask to have the headquarters of the company being situated on the territory. Otherwise, they will not get access to some data. And that is to the contrary of what we would like to see. So for me, that's certainly one of the major subjects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Very good ideas there. Shaima, would you like to come in on this from your perspective?
Sure. First of all, I think it's important for regulators to understand that technologies continue to evolve, and they certainly disrupt. So the gap between the evolution of any given technology has grown very, very noticeably smaller, which is why it's important for governments to keep cross-dialogues open to understand how each side addresses and supports innovation and digitalization. The UAE has taken concrete steps in terms of establishing a strong digital economy and make use of the advantages and the benefits driven by or provided by the digital transformation. And it's actually one of the key contributors of or key pillars in our the 2031 vision, so our medium-term vision and as well as our longer-term vision. I was just looking for the contribution of digital economy within the UAE's GDP, and it's currently 9.7%, but our target is to double that to over 20% by 2031. So there's a lot of room for us to kind of, well, not a lot of room. We have limited time for us to make sure that the contribution of digital economy within our GDP actually reaches its target. I think in terms of cybersecurity and free flow of data is something that It's a very tricky subject for each country to kind of consider that, but UAE has been very transparent when it comes to that. Obviously, there are things that are way above my pay grade, but I know that we have a very kind of transparent government that continues to update its people, and I think there's a lot of homework for the EU embassy in the UAE to continue providing these updates and opportunities for the UAE and the region.
Thank you very much. Any other panelists want to comment on this question? Very good. Well, perhaps to come back on the issue of the SMEs, I would like to hear your views, maybe going a bit more into detail of what obstacles the SMEs and startups encounter when trying to attract investment from the GCC or from the EU. And any concrete recommendations how these obstacles could be overcome, apart of course what was already mentioned. Pascal, would you like to develop on that?
Well, I think we have covered a bit already this by listening what are the difficulties for the SMEs, which are bigger than, it has already mentioned, these obstacles are bigger for SMEs than for big companies who normally have the sufficient resources to get information on. So for the startups who are always willing to go fast, to find information quickly is absolutely key. And the less barriers you have, the better. So for those companies, having the technology at hand, having the cables, so all the infrastructure for the digital is key. So optical fibers and 3G and 5G and 6G soon. So investment in that part is important to give them the environment to be able to thrive. We mentioned the necessity to have the networking possibility for them to find information quickly, to find partners and to find possible clients through the different networks of chambers. And then we need to have a legal environment which is easy for them to understand and to get access to, because if you have to pay a consultant or a lawyer to know what you have to do, you already have to pay a certain part of your potential profits, and therefore it is less attractive. So for me, it's a whole environment which automatically. Well, one thing is I don't like when we speak about the SMEs in particular. Basil just mentioned it. This is 99% of our companies. So the law is for them. Eventually do some exception for the big companies, but for the small companies, they are all small companies, and therefore the legislation as a whole is for them, and there is no need for a specific treatment for the SMEs, which are the economy. So I never understood why we need to have a special SME policy while it is actually the policy is for them.
Thank you, Pascal. Well, that's I guess, quite indicative of how far we've gone in the EU in terms of promoting SMEs. That the SME is becoming a mainstream economy. So I see your point that maybe there's no longer so much need to create a specific approach for them. But that may not be the case in all regions, such as the GCC. Shaima, would you like to come in on this?
Sure. I think it's worth exploring within the private sector is venture capital and private equity firms from our respective nations to be engaged in ongoing dialogue. Venture capital firms often hold board seats in their portfolio companies, and the portfolio companies rely on their VCs to assist with scaling up and international expansion. I was just looking up, I'm glad that I have my phone. I was just looking up one of the initiatives that we launched. It's called Next Gen FDI, basically designed to attract the world's most promising companies to the UAE. It's straightforward. It's basically supercharges the digital economy, create well-paid jobs, and fast-track plans to become a diversified, knowledge-driven economy primed by the fourth industrial revolution. So, there continues to be reforms, new initiatives, because we understand the need, you know. Sometimes it takes us a while, maybe it takes us a year or two to kind of catch up with the global trends, but I think we always try to keep up and we always try to align. I mean, our weekends have changed now. So it's Saturday and Sunday to kind of facilitate businesses and continue working with the international benchmark and the international market. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, your recent change about the weekend is a really good indication how you're aligning with, in a very concrete way in the business practices with the EU and other partners. Unless any comments from other panelists? Sofia?
Maybe I can add up to what Pascal and Shaima said. I think there is this mentality issue that SMEs are incapable of adapting, or SMEs have more needs. Yes, they do. They have more specific needs, perhaps. They need more time to adapt. But as Pascal said, the regulation is the same for everybody. So I think that we need to keep this in mind when we regulate, that we regulate for everybody, including SMEs. So I think this is not something that we always keep in mind in the EU, and we see it because we have very complex regulations, and sometimes the guidance to implement those regulations does not come in time, or the supportive instruments are not there in time. So definitely there is some room for improvement there. Also on the EU side, on how we can utilize better the regulatory environment and how to support SMEs. And then the issue of scalability, I totally agree with you. You need different sources of finance. You need to be able to find investments to scale up and go international. And we know that not all startups are going to survive, unfortunately. This is a key aspect. And I also want to connect it with innovation and also the mentality of failure that we have in the EU, which is perhaps different than the GCC, especially in the digital sector. If you fail once in the EU and the next time you go to the bank, especially if you're an SME, and look for a loan, well, good luck. It is as simple as that. So we also need to change this kind of way of thinking and also support those businesses and those minds that are willing to invest in more ideas and new ideas and eventually become more successful and scale up.
Sorry, can I ask a...
Sure.
Is that fear of failure, is it a common thing that you kind of, or feedback that you receive from your SMEs? Or at least entrepreneurs and like innovators, you know, like those with big ideas, but are kind of bound by the fear of failing?
I wouldn't say that it's a fear of failing from the part of the innovators themselves or the SMEs. It is rather a more systemic, institutional fear of failure. And that's why I talked about the example of the banks. This would not happen in the US. The US would ask you, how many times have you failed? The more you have failed, the more likely it would be to get your finance. So this is the mentality issue I'm referring to when I talk about the EU example and startups in particular.
We don't have the culture. You mentioned two words that actually didn't even came to my mind, because venture capital is something that it is not spread out here. So if you want to get money, you go to the bank. You have some business angels, but not that many. But it's not into the culture. It is in the United States, a little bit in the UK, which is not in the EU anymore. So we're really missing that. So I hope you'll be able to develop that yourself.
So we just learned that in the US, the more you fail, the more you'll learn, and it's not exactly like that in the EU. So Basil, how you see it in the GCC? What's the mentality?
Well, to be honest with you, the private sector or the startups or the main obstacle was access to finance. But now we have funds in the GCC that will subsidize startup projects and businesses. But the issue here is sustainability of this certain project. The government will give you the money, but you cannot sustain that business. This is why we need to learn from our European counterparts in how to mentor the small and medium enterprises. I've been working at the FGCC for the past 15 years, met with a lot of European chambers of commerce, and one astonishing thing that they do is they take from the mega companies money and give it to the small enterprises. So this is a great tactic. Mm-hmm. It's all about mentality. It's all about mentoring the small and medium enterprises to sustain its business longer and not leave the market.
Thank you very much. Well, before we go to my last question, I would like to have a look at the graphic harvest that Christoph has been working on. So perhaps you can put some of that on the screen. I already saw a glimpse of that earlier.
Yeah, I saw hearts.
Mm.
We need to vote which panel did the best.
Well, we have hearts on ours, so.
I see it here, but still not on the main screen. No, it's getting there. So we have investing outside of oil and gas, mentoring SMEs are really in the center, role of education, as well as investment promotion. And we have also the legal frameworks that can also be sometimes impediment for investment. And the issue of private versus public. So a lot of interesting elements there. And we'll see how that is going to be finalized still with the questions and my final question. So going for my final question for the panelists, and this is a kind of a very broad one. I would like to ask you, what are your top recommendations for business and policy leaders in terms of further enhancing investment between our two regions? And Sofia, you could start.
Two recommendations. The first one is really see what we can do to update our existing framework that allows EU-GCC relations to operate. We have a partnership agreement that is very, very old. We have been trying to conclude a free trade agreement for some time. Unfortunately, negotiations failed. This means that we are left with a framework that is not modern, that is not up to the task. Therefore, the question from the business community is what we can do to improve the situation, to find solutions. And I know that this is more of a political question, if you like, so I would like to understand what the political willingness is to move towards this kind of solutions beyond all the softer instruments that we talked about at the level of the WTO or the dialogue and the projects that we have in place. Because what we are looking for here is concrete, tangible results. And of course, you can facilitate, you can improve, but the real change is going to happen with a hard legal instrument, if you like. And I know that this is challenging. This is not without, let's say, I don't hesitate to say that this is going to be very challenging, of course, because the world has changed since 2008 when we stopped negotiating. And we have a new framework, as we said before, where the EU negotiates trade agreements. But I think that there are possibilities there to explore. And then another dimension I would like to bring is from purely a business perspective, engagement of the private sector in the policy-making process in the GCC. We have good examples from the EU. We have public consultations, impact assessments, very often exchanges with businesses. Both ex ante and ex post regulation is being developed. And this has been a critical tool to make sure that we have workable legal frameworks and implementable legal frameworks. So I think that this is an example that we can look also in our bilateral relations And especially when we talk about improving the regulatory environment and attractiveness of investments in the GCC, the involvement of the local private sector through associations and companies, both levels, I think it is very, very critical. So that would be my two, let's say, recommendations to the governments.
Thank you very much, Sofia. And perhaps handing over to Shaima, how do you see this from your perspective? What recommendations could you give either to the governments or business sector?
So while we don't have an FTA in place, negotiating an FTA might take years. But we do have the strategic partnership that was announced or launched in May that I feel gives a great framework for us to kind of use that as a reference and a starting point to come up with more practical actions between EU and GCC. I want to be very practical and efficient and say, let's not do research. Let's just get on the ground, let's implement projects, let's matchmake our priority sectors, identify the gaps, identify the opportunities. I think with that, we will see great partnership on the ground. I mean, while this is helpful, I think we should continue our coordination, our dialogue through maybe embassies or the chambers of commerce, and you have my contact, and we can arrange further ideas and come up with an action plan that is more practical.
Thank you very much. Very good ideas there. Hands-on approach, that's certainly something that will work. And Pascal, how about you?
Well, I will not make a list of recommendations to the business. I think if we can achieve everything we have already mentioned and to the matchmaking and all of that, I think we have talked about it sufficiently. So I'd like to focus on my recommendation to the governments, and I'd like to touch two levels. The first one would be to see what can be done by all, i.e. the European Union and the GCC in multilateral and plurilateral level, and here in particular at the WTO. There is a possibility for the GCC to be a bit more active into this. I will start with the government procurement agreement of the WTO, which is a plurilateral agreement, but of which none of the GCC countries are part of, and Oman and Saudi Arabia, who acceded to the WTO a little bit later on, normally have promised to be active into joining the GPA, but that is not yet the case. Bahrain is an observer, but Kuwait, Qatar, and the Emirates are not at all involved, to my knowledge. So I think an encouragement to move into this direction would be certainly more than welcome. Then you have the forthcoming WTO ministerial, the 13th ministerial, which is coming in 1 year time. We just finished the last one in Geneva in June, so the next one will be coming up. In addition to the multilateral, there are ongoing joint statement initiative. Sophia has mentioned the one on investment facilitation. This is the title of this session. I think it would be good. I think nearly all GCC members are participating to this initiative except Oman. So if we could encourage Oman to join in. They are moving in. This is 105 countries in the WTO moving towards some possible disciplines to have more transparency into what a company needs to do in a country to get access and to invest in a country. So more or less what we have already done into the services part that I have mentioned, in services domestic regulation, is to give transparency to the investors. It's really pragmatic. It's hopefully they will move on towards an agreement by next year or at the latest in 2024. So if all GCC countries in the EU can be pushing in the same direction, I think that would be good. It's not really, there is nothing to do with market access for investment, but it is giving the information to the potential investors. It's nothing to do either with investment protection, dispute settlement into this agreement. So the tricky issues have been put on the side. So I hope we'll be able to move on there. Finally, there is the joint statement initiative on e-commerce. which is about the digital trade, which is really what we mentioned much today about the innovation into the digital economy. There again, Oman is the only country which is not part of it, so it's good to have already the five countries active into this. The countries, this is now 87 countries which are participating to this initiative. They have already written a little bit more than 10 articles of a potential global rules on e-commerce, finding rules on e-authentication, e-signature, e-contract, e-invoicing, paperless trading, customer confidence into the digital, etc., anti-spam. So all of that is already done. Whether or not they'll be able to achieve a proper agreement in a short time, I think is more complicated because we haven't touched yet the critical issues, which would be what I have mentioned earlier on about data flow, cross-border data flow, and in our side, in European Union, we have the data protection of the personal data. It's very high on the agenda. How to reconcile all of this, and there are still a growing number of countries, as I said, which are willing to have data localization requirement, and that would be contrary to that agreement. So I don't know whether we'll be able to finalize this agreement with 87 countries or not, but the more they discuss about it, in any case, the better, and it is good that our two regions are involved into that. So that would be my recommendations for the multilateral level and plurilateral level. If we go down to the bilateral level now, Sophia has mentioned indeed that we had some EU-GCC FTA launch a long time ago. It has stalled, and I think it's going to be effectively complicated to relaunch this exercise. I was hoping that to see some light at a point in time in the last years to come, but clearly there are still some difficulties and barrier there. Will it be possible? I mean, that is up to you to decide, but certainly on our side, we will certainly be signing on. If it is not possible to have the whole GCC countries doing a bilateral with the European Union, will it need to be possible to have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of bilateral countries instead of the whole region? That might be a way to try to put on the side some difficulties. Of course, here we have in mind the export duties on oil that some countries would like to keep, and that is for the European Union a no-go. What's the point? I mean, what is an FTA? An FTA is exclusively to consolidate a legal framework, so legal certainty for the investors and traders. If into that agreement you have one of the country keeping the possibility to raise duties certainly out of the blue, this is a country to legal certainty. So that's something, of course, we have difficulty with. But there is also a possible other alternative to an FTA between the region, and that is something we have done or tried to do with China, as a so-called comprehensive agreement on investment. That would be a solution to avoid negotiating tariff and the export duties. And that would be an agreement where you're going to be able to negotiate nearly everything but trade in goods. So you will have trade in services, you will have intellectual property rights, you will have public procurement, you will have all the investment part and market access into the investment. So I think there is a possibility to do something relatively deep, and that's the reason why we call it comprehensive. Although not touching the goods aspect, and that is of course an issue, but at least it would be a way to do something instead of not doing anything, because we have been stuck. I think the first EU-GCC negotiation started in 1999, so that's a very long time ago. The negotiating directive was in 2001, but it's told in 2008. So clearly, this is too long and nothing has been done, so let's try to find and be creative, find a solution, doing something else, and maybe an investment agreement might be possibly. Now, we know in the European Union that it is not possible to sign any agreement with the European Union anymore now, even if it is not an FTA but only an investment, if we do not go into our so-called trade and sustainable development. And therefore, we know that if we want even to do only an investment agreement. We will need to negotiate with the GCC countries something on trade and labor, or something on trade and environment, something on trade and human rights, which is now something which is part of our agreements. And that is something it's now a must, and it will not be possible to get it ratified in the European Parliament if we don't get this. So we need to be aware about that also. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. That was a lot of concrete suggestions, and I really appreciate for you to detailing them out. Now, Basil, would you have some advice?
Yes. The world is very small, to be honest with you. And with the new technology, it's even smaller. And the next decade, it's going to be smaller and smaller and shrink. So we need to grab the opportunities as soon as possible. With regards to the negotiation for the GCC European FTA, one idea, and back in 2008, we won a grant with the Euro Chambers. We have uplifted a joint statement to push for the FTA, and it was to President Nicolas Sarkozy at that time. So why don't you do another joint statement between the GCC and the EU and uplift it to the President of the European, as a GCC? And what happened to that?
It's a general framework now.
Yes.
It's signed. Now, like I mentioned, I think that is like...
That's my question.
Sorry. It's a strategic partnership that the EU and GCC have signed to, and that provides a framework for the work of our partnership in different areas from now on.
But as in to kick off, start once again the negotiation for the FTA, because it halted back in 2008, if I'm not mistaken.
If I may jump in there, I mean, of course, the strategic partnership is a very good agreement and necessity, and it is opening up the possibility of discussion and dialogues on many other issues like defense and security and foreign affairs. But we are representing business. There is not much in there. If we do not go into a proper legal agreement, either of an FTA or an investment agreement with legally binding commitments that companies can trust on, something is going to be missing. We can, I mean, otherwise the strategic agreement is good, but my strong advice is to each countries do your own proper domestic work, modify your domestic regulation to be sure that you'll be welcoming foreign companies, and increase the awareness through everything we have said before into the networks of all of those facilities.
Also we need to have more dialogues. We need to have more events going on between the EU and the GCC to outline the investment opportunities taking place in both regions, to outline the obstacles of trade. The more we have, the more understanding, the more awareness we can create. Also to expand the range of sectors of cooperation and partnerships to include emerging sectors such as digital 4 and 5 industrial revolution, green economy, environment, climate protection. Of course, SMEs, women, and entrepreneurships should be given also a priority in cooperation among GCC and European businesses.
Thank you very much, Basil. Then I think it's time for the questions from the audience. Who would like to start? Do you have a microphone for the audience? There's here first. Okay.
Thank you. So I'm from the European Commission DG Trade. I would like to ask from the GCC and the UAE representatives, because we have seen that there are these kind of localization programs in different individual GCC countries, where basically companies are saying that actually they have to choose between the GCC countries, so that there is a kind of competition. But do you think at one point there could be like harmonization? So the benefits, I mean, that the investor would be looking, that it would not only be, you know, that the local manufacturing has to be in the country X or country Z, but it could be that you can still get the points from if they are in the GCC. Do you think this would increase the investments, or in the contrary?
Yes. Well, we already have a common market between the GCC. So per se, you open a factory in Bahrain. You could export those products and commodities to the rest of the GCC countries without any tariffs. So there is a harmonization into that sense as well too. And by the way, competition is very healthy, whether it's internal or among the GCC states.
Would you like to share my compliment on that?
I think he covered it well.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. And then we have here.
Thank you. Yeah, I have just comment to clarify. One comment and another question. First of all, I think we need really to differentiate and give the SMEs that kind of privilege, especially when in the GCC. Basically, the SME you know, it's not the SME we know in the GCC. The SME you know, it's part of your supply chain. I'll go to Stuttgart, I'll look at Porsche, I'll find out the doors is made from next door SME. I mean, seats are made from another SME. The value chain and supply chain of those big exporters of those of European countries, they are part of that SME. But the SME, we know they are not. They couldn't get their stake. I mean, let's take for example the giant Aramco. How many Saudi SME is supplying to Aramco? Negligible. When you look at the value chain of Aramco, you will find that it's just peanuts. So we do really need to have that kind of policy, which should make SME prosper and make them successful and make them grow. The second, this is the first point. The second point is. Currently, there is energy crisis, and I don't know if this is something can we investigate. There is like energy crisis going on in Europe, basically, and so many companies, businesses are going insolvency. I mean, do you think GCC can be like a resort for those where we can play any kind of role and trying to, whether it's on outsourcing, offshoring, whatsoever, you name it, opening a new production line in the GCC. Is that something can be done? I don't know.
Thank you for the question. I think it was in two parts. First about SMEs and their role in value chains, and then the question of energy crisis and how that can convert into perhaps further investment in the GCC. So who would like to start? Sophia.
Yes, very interesting point. So thank you very much. Indeed, this is something that we often forget because, as Timo was also saying, SMEs in Europe, of course, are the bulk of the economy, but we also have been working for many, many years to develop those. And you even see differences between SMEs if you look at different EU member states. So an SME in Germany is very different from an SME in another country, put it very simply. Now, the key question for me is indeed, how do you bring more SMEs from the GCC into the global supply chains? And you talked about the Saudi Aramco case, that it's very negligible, the involvement of SMEs in their supply. But what about foreign companies? The question we have here is, how can you ensure and develop partnerships between big suppliers, big European investors in the GCC that use local SMEs in their supply chain, so they help them scale up and internationalize? So this is perhaps a very interesting question that we can definitely look at.
What about taking those struggling businesses from Europe to, especially the energy, those who are facing challenges?
This is a very difficult point, and we see that it's an energy crisis. Energy in Europe is very expensive. And we see that the problem is with the energy-intensive sectors, of course. We have many cases from ceramics, aluminium, steel. These are particular sectors. To tell you the truth, I'm not aware about how this market is in the GCC, maybe ceramics, but I'm not sure about the others. So this is a question perhaps that we need to look further on our side as well. But for us, this is a company decision, if you like. We would never like a top-down solution. But of course, we see we see the tendency. So many companies argue that if it is very expensive for us to produce in Europe, yes, of course, we are going to consider other opportunities.
But I think it has been said earlier on that localization or relocalization or changing location from Europe to GCC, it's a long-term process. Mm-hmm. And hopefully we're going to be out of the crisis before that. So I don't know. One of the solutions about the energy crisis is to bring more oil cheaper in Europe. Therefore, OPEC changing policy and making more production, that would be participating to this. Now, I wanted also to mention the issue about, you mentioned, Basil, you mentioned that there is a common market in the GCC, saying that you don't have any custom duties anymore. So it's more a custom union. We consider we do have a single market in European Union, but it is not finished. And in the services sectors, we still have some difficulties. So encouraging the GCC to go into building a proper single market in terms of having common legislations in many different areas for all the economy will contribute to make your region more attractive, because it will increase the scale and the size of the market, because for the moment it's, I don't know what it is, about 50 million, the whole 6 countries, but it is still very fragmented in terms of regulation in some areas, not in all of them, but in some areas. And that would certainly be interesting to see some progress in that area as well. So that European companies willing to go into the GCC, they know they will have access to the GCC as one market instead of having access to 6 different markets.
Thank you very much. That was an interesting question, and I'd like to add that, of course, when you talk about possible relocations of the SMEs, we should not forget that the majority of the SMEs are actually not international, and by definition cannot be international. So for them to relocate for cheaper energy, for example, would not be that obvious. It's just a little comment I want to make. But I know there's one more question there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mareike Mein, GFA Consulting Group. We heard a lot about the EU interest in the GCC and about your claims of how an FTA, a deep and comprehensive FTA, should look like. And I would like to hear a little bit more about the GCC offensive interest into the EU market. If you could elaborate a little bit on this.
Well, you know, the EU is very advanced in so many areas, to be honest with you. So we're here to acquire, let's say, the technologies, to have a joint venture between European and GCC companies, whether to invest in the GCC or to invest in Europe. So we want to learn from the best practices, especially when it comes to programs for digital and technical knowledge. It's basically cooperation between the 2 sides. Want to add something, Shema?
So I think when it comes to, I'm going to speak on behalf of the UAE, when it comes to our interest in investing abroad, there's always opportunities and common priority sectors that we usually look into, right? So say here in Belgium or as EU, you have a shared, your priority sector is in relation to, say, climate change. And that is something that we as UAE are also very, very much interested in. As we launched the net zero, our net zero commitment earlier this year, and we're also hosting COP28. So that is something that such dialogue actually facilitates us identifying the shared priority sectors, our shared common interests, so that when we go into deals, when we go into realizing any of our shared kind of priorities, we do it that serves both parties.